And my first question to you, is about your evaluation of what is happening in Ukraine. During last couple of days, there were many reports about Ukrainian successes. General Petraeus, former CIA director, other distinguished military officers from different administrations, they are not only saying that Ukraine is winning, they are claiming that Ukrainian successes are irreversible. And I have to confess, Colonel, that when I look at the Russian media, for the first time I hear Russian senior officials also being quite skeptical of Russian performance. And I also read about dozens, actually more than 100,000 Russian men trying to escape from Russia, going to other countries in order to avoid Putin's partial mobilization. What's going on, you think?
Well, thank you for inviting me today, Dmitry. I think we have to be careful what we conclude based on the reports that come through the mainstream media, first of all, in the West. These latest counterattacks are in a series of counterattacks that have cost the Ukrainian forces enormous numbers of lives. We can't even begin to imagine how desperate the Ukrainian army must be at this point, having lost close to 100,000 dead. And the only thing I can think of is that they are desperate to try and drag in the United States and NATO on their behalf, and so they're launching these attacks relentlessly in the hopes they can create the illusion of success. The truth is that these counterattacks have achieved very, very little. The Russians are running what we would call in the West an economy of force mission in southern Ukraine. And they've given ground when they thought it was necessary to do so. But in most cases, the distance when we talk about giving ground is the distance perhaps in this area between Culpeper, Virginia and Warrenton, Virginia, or Warrenton, Virginia and Manassas. In other words, 23, 24 miles. Then it stops. The Russians adopt a new defensive position. The bulk of the regular Russian army is not involved in these things, and they are building up for what I think will be very substantial offensive operations in the future.
This is a very complex situation. I realize it. I particularly realize it because I live close to Warrenton, Virginia. So I understand the geography, which you have just mentioned. And particularly if you are talking about areas which are not quite urban, where there is a lot of open space, which allows quick maneuver, it's very easy to confuse a tactical success with strategic victory. Having said
Precisely.
if you look at what the Russians themselves are saying, if you look at Russian telegraph channels, they are filled, I wouldn't hesitate to say, despair. A lot of people are almost as desperate as they were on October 15th, 1941, when a lot of people in Moscow were predicting an imminent German takeover. Well, we know it did not quite happen, and we know how that war have ended. For Russia, it ended in Berlin. Having said that, it certainly is not what the Russian High Command have expected. It certainly is not clearly the way they visualize their military operations. Do you think, first, that there were serious Russian errors of judgment, military errors of judgment? And do you think, assuming such errors took place, that the Russians still could repair the damage?
Well, first of all, I think any army that has spent many years in garrison and takes the field in large numbers to conduct high-end conventional warfare is going to make some mistakes and have some problems. I don't see any of those really as being either irreversible or all that serious. I think people need to understand something, and I'm sure the Russian population is curious because the entire approach to this campaign has been very different from what one would have normally expected from Russian military doctrine. But that's because this was always designed to be a limited operation to move into limited areas with the purpose of destroying Ukrainian forces. Now, that mission was largely accomplished, but there was a key underlying assumption, and that assumption was that Moscow would have someone to negotiate with, that there would be an interest in bringing the conflict to a close. I don't think Moscow ever thought that the United States would try to turn this into a desperate situation for Russia. And the Americans have made some serious mistakes in this connection. They assumed that they could crush Russia financially and economically, and they didn't understand that Russia stood outside of that system. They've also tried to isolate Russia from the rest of the world, when in fact the rest of the world, minus Europe and North America, is largely sided with Russia. So I think the United States has underestimated this. The other thing is the United States thought they could win by essentially exposing millions of Ukrainians to terrible conditions. I don't think that's worked very well. I think the Ukrainians have suffered terribly, and under normal circumstances, I think this would already be over. But London and Washington in particular want it to continue. So now the operation has to change in terms of character and purpose. And I think that's what we will see in the very near future. And that's the purpose behind the limited mobilization of 300,000 reservists.
Well, that sounds persuasive to me, but I have one major concern. And my concern is for those few people in the audience who don't know you, you are not only a very distinguished combat veteran, you are not only a media star, you are an author of 5 major books on military issues. You are a very serious and original strategic thinker. And in that capacity, let me ask you a question. If you look at G7, and G7, all these 7 major nations are now with Ukraine against Russia. Their GDP together is 28 times of the Russian GDP. If you look at military budgets, their military budgets are 24 times higher than the Russian military budget. And as you know better than me, at the beginning of the Ukrainian campaign, there was some, I would say, hesitation in the West, particularly in Washington, in supplying Ukraine with most modern, sophisticated, high-precision, long-distance weapons. This hesitation is still there, but in terms of what is permissible without provoking Russia too much, well, I think the analysis is today that we can do more than was originally considered appropriate. How under those circumstances can Russia win if this war lasts for months or years?
Well, expressing support for the position the United States takes falls far short of sending troops to fight in a war. There is no appetite whatsoever in Europe, with the possible exception of the Poles. Nowhere else in Europe is anyone interested in being dragged into a war with Russia. And right now, the support for Russia from the United States European allies is shrunk to a trickle. It's drying up. And we are now reaching the end of our war stocks. In the meantime, the predictions that the Russians would run out of munitions, the Russians would run out of tanks, and everything else, all that's nonsense. The Russians have plenty of ammunition, plenty of equipment, and the bulk of their forces have not been engaged. The Russians have never committed more than 20% of the Russian regular army to Ukraine. Again, that's going to change at this point. I think Moscow has finally given up on the potential for any negotiated settlement. And then there's another aspect that has to be brought into this, and that's the economic damage done by the sanctions leveled at Russia to Europe. Europe's in a very serious position right now, particularly Germany. And frankly, Germany is the keystone in the edifice of NATO and the European Union. The Germans are furious. They're angry. They're frustrated. They don't understand what's happened. They're particularly frustrated with the Poles, who seem to be determined to find a way to war with Russia. I think we're going to see changes in the German and French and other European governments on the model of Mrs. Meloni's victory in Italy. And I think these will change the strategic complexion of the entire event. And Ukraine, by the way, is going to suffer terribly as the winter wears on. And there will be no help for Ukraine from the Europeans or the United States to deal with that effectively.